The antiseptic bite of the hallway hit the back of my throat as the OR schedule blinked Carter, ELI transplant. Then I heard two nurses whisper at the med cart, casual as weather. His parents signed the consent he doesn't know. Eli's gaze found mine over the gurney rail, and betrayal flooded his face before the fear ever could. So let me take you back. The first time I met Eli Carter, it wasn't during a heroic save. It was in an elevator that smelled like rain-soaked coats and old coffee, where his mother held a folder so tight her knuckles went pale. He stood half a step behind her, 19 and already wearing that practice stillness you learn when your body has betrayed you too many times. A knit cap pulled low and a mask hiding everything but the exhaustion in his eyes. When the doors opened to the oncology floor, the sound washed over us monitors chirping in uneven keys, wheels squeaking, a mop bucket sloshing like a tired metronome. His room was bright in the wrong way. Sunlight bouncing off white sheets and the plastic gloss of the four-pole, making everything look cleaner than it ever is. I introduced myself and watched him track every word as if he'd been burned by promises before. While his dad tried to fill the space with optimism, new options, better odds. An amazing team. When I asked what he wanted from this admission, Eli didn't dramatize it. He said he was done with aggressive treatment, done with protocols that took everything and never gave him his life back. There's a particular quiet after a patient says no, especially on a floor built to say yes. The nurse beside me, Jessa, steady hands, tired smile paused with a cuff half unrolled, like she'd heard a rule break. Eli spoke calmly, explaining he'd tried the last experimental regimen. He'd watched his body swell and bruise and hollow out, and he couldn't do another round of maybe. Under the calm I heard something else, not indecision, but a fierce need for peace, and the fear that peace would be treated like surrender. In the United States, once a person is a legal adult, most states set that at 18 parents don't get to sign consent over an adult child's refusal just because they're terrified. I didn't say it as a lecture, because fear doesn't listen to lectures. But the fact sat between us anyway, heavy as the lead apron outside radiology. Eli's mom insisted he was not himself, that sadness was talking. And Eli flinched as if his mind had been turned into another organ failing on a lab report. My attending, Dr. Priya Nandakuma, arrived with her coat still open and her pager already angry, and she did what she always does, she made the room big enough for the truth. She asked Eli to tell it again, not for documentation, but for dignity. And his voice stayed steady until it cracked on the word tired. Doctor. Nandakumar laid out the options in plain language, what a transplant could offer, what it could cost, what stopping could mean. And she kept returning to the same anchor. The choice had to be Eli's. Outside the room, the hallway air was cold enough to raise gooseflesh under my scrubs, and Jessa handed me coffee that tasted burned and reheated. She asked whether we should call psychiatry, whether we should call ethics, whether anyone could keep this from turning into a fight with a hospital wristband as the prize. I stared at the chart and thought about how informed consent is supposed to be a conversation that leads to a patience, voluntary agreement, not a signature obtained from someone who loves them too hard to listen. Down the corridor, Eli's parents were already making calls, and I could feel the unit beginning to tilt toward the operating room. By nightfall, the floor had that pre-storm feeling, too quiet in some corners, too loud in others, as if the building couldn't decide whether to pray or panic. Eli's fever climbed despite treatment, and the skin under his eyes turned the bruised gray of someone who hasn't slept in weeks. When I entered his room, the monitor's rhythm had a new urgency, and the air held the sharp bite of antiseptic layered over something faintly metallic. His parents arrived with the energy of people who have been sprinting through phone calls and worst-case scenarios. Karim Printiuj Dr. Nandakumar warned them that infection made every option riskier. But Eli's mother heard only the word chance, as if repeating it could change the odds. Eli stared past all of us, jaw set, while his dad begged him again to, please just do this, and the pleading sounded less like love than like panic trying to wear love's clothing. When Eli's blood pressure dipped, it happened with the cruelty of a switch, sudden and absolute. Jessa called my name, and the room snapped into motion, fluids running in, the bed lowering. Hands moving with the speed you learn when you've seen this too many times. Eli's eyes found mine, and a bitter question lived there. If I'm this sick, why does it still feel like I'm being forced? I kept my voice low, telling him what we were doing in simple words, while the beeping accelerated into a thin, relentless alarm. We stabilized him enough to avoid the ICU, but enough is a temporary truce in oncology. Latir, Doctor. Nandakumar pulled me into the workrooms, harsh computer glow, and told me the transplant team had an opening and OR slot. A donor lined up, a timeline that looked like salvation on a calendar. Eli still refused, and psychiatry's note read the way these notes sometimes do, grief and fear. Yes, but consistent, aware, not delirious, not confused. Policies can chart risks, but they can't chart what it costs a young man to be told his refusal will be treated as a symptom. We're calling ethics, she said, and I felt the words move through the unit like a cold front. Hospital ethics committees are meant for moments like this, offering a structured forum, protecting patient rights, and mediating when the patient, the family, and the team are pulling in different directions. Still, the clock didn't slow. The schedule board in pre-op filled in with neat block letters that never mention heartbreak. In the middle of it was Eli, dozing fitfully, waking to nausea, then to his mother smoothing his blanket like she could tuck mortality out of sight. Near dawn, I passed the nurses' station and heard two night nurses leaning close to the computer, their voices hushed with the careless intimacy of exhaustion. One pointed at the consent section and said the parents had signed and the case was still on for the afternoon. The other murmured that Eli didn't know, that he thought he still had time. I turned, and Eli was there in the doorway, barefoot on cold tile, the 4-pump trailing behind him like a leash. His face went blank for a heartbeat before it folded into recognition, and he didn't look at the chart. He looked at us, as if we'd all just confessed who we really were. Eli didn't go back to bed after he heard them. He drifted toward the stairwell, dragging his 4-pump like a reluctant suitcase. And I followed at a distance that said I wasn't here to corner him. The stairwell smelled of bleach and dust, cooler than the hallway, the kind of cold that makes you feel awake even when you're not. He sat on the landing, knees pulled up, and whispered, "So I'm not a person. I'm a procedure." When we returned, his parents were waiting, faces lit by phone screens and stale vending machine light. His mother lunged for his hand, then stopped when she saw his expression, as if she'd touched a hot stove. "We had to," she said before he asked, and her voice carried that frantic softness people use with drowning swimmers. His father kept repeating it's the only shot, but he couldn't meet Eli's eyes. Only how someone announced the OR, time change over the intercom, cheerful and oblivious. Ethics arrived in the form of Dr. Howard Lynn, a small man with a comm that didn't perform. He asked for a quiet room, not because the decision needed privacy, but because it needed oxygen. Jessa brought tissues without comment. I noticed her hands shaking only when she thought no one was looking. Dr. Lynn opened the chart, then closed it and said, "Informed consent isn't a signature. It's an ongoing, voluntary conversation." The transplant surgeon joined by speakerphone, clipped and impatient, talking about donor windows and lost opportunities. Dr. Nandakumar pushed back, voice low, reminding him that Eli had refused repeatedly, consistently, even before the fever. Psychiatry's note was read aloud in plain terms. Grief, anxiety, a heavy sadness, but no confusion, no hallucinations. No evidence he couldn't understand the choice. Eli's mother-insisted depression was stealing his future. Eli stared at the table like it was safer than her face. When it was his turn, Eli didn't raise his voice. He said he knew what the transplant offered, a chance, and also a long tunnel of suffering with no guarantee of daylight. He said he wanted to go home, taste real food, sit on his porch with his little sister, and decide how his story ended without being pinned down by love. Jessa swallowed hard, and I understood we weren't debating medicine anymore. We were debating whether fear could wear a parent's name and still be allowed to choose. Dr. Lin asked the question that made the room go still. If we sedated him against his will, what would we call it besides violence dressed in sterile blue? The surgeon said delay could kill him. The parents said refusing would kill him in a different way. Doctor. Nandakuma looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a doctor's exhaustion and a human being's horror. The ethics recommendation came quietly. Pause the case. Meet with Eli alone. Document his wishes, yet the OR board kept blinking. Bright and indifferent, counting down to the moment we have to act. Pre-op smelled like iodine and plastic, and the air conditioning bit through Eli's thin gown as the transport orderly parked him beneath a clock that never blinked. The OR doors were closed, but I could hear the muffled music someone always played to pretend this was ordinary. Eli kept his hands on the rails, not because he needed support, but because he was anchoring himself to his own body. His mother hovered with the consent packet like a passport, and his father kept saying, "Just let them start, and you'll feel different." Jessa met my eyes over the chart rack, her expression asking permission to stop the conveyor belt, and I nodded before I even thought about consequences. I stepped close to Eli and spoke low, the way you do when a hallway has too many ears. Tell me yes, or tell me no, right now, in your own words. He swallowed, lips cracked, and said, "No, not today. Not ever." The surgeon's voice carried from inside the workroom, sharp with schedule and scarcity, and I felt my stomach tighten as if I'd stepped onto ice. Dr. Nandakuma came fast, coat flaring behind her, and asked the only question that mattered. "Eli, do you understand what they're proposing, and do you still refuse?" He answered without hesitation, and the steadiness in his tone did more than any test could have done. In the US, an 18-year-old is generally treated as a legal adult from medical consent, and a parent's signature can't erase a competent adult's refusal. Dr. Lin from ethics arrived with hospital counsel, and he repeated, gently, that consent is voluntary and ongoing, not a one-time form. Eli's mother broke then, not with screaming, but with a sound like air tearing out of a balloon. And she begged us to see her son as a boy who couldn't trust his own mind. She talked about temporary depression, about how pain can make anyone say no. And she asked Dr. Nandakuma if we'd really let a mood decide a life. Psychiatry's note sat in the chart like a sealed envelope, stating he was grieving but lucid. And his father kept tapping the page as if repetition could rewrite it. The transplant surgeon finally emerged, mask dangling, and said the donor window wouldn't wait for a family meeting. They rolled Eli toward the double doors anyway, a slow forward motion that felt like the start of something you can't apologize for later. He lifted his head and said, "Clear enough for everyone, I do not consent," and the orderly stopped, hands hovering, waiting for someone higher on the ladder to tell him what conscience allowed. Eli reached for my sleeve with fingers that were cold and damp, and he whispered, "Write it down. Make it real, doctor." Nandakuma pulled a pen from her pocket, placed the refusal form on his lap, and watched him sign with a trembling hand that still belonged to him. When his mother tried to snatch the paper, Jessa stepped between them, small but immovable, and the hallway went silent except for the monitor's stubborn beep. Hospital counsel told the team to stand down, and the anesthesiologist exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. No one wants to be the person who puts someone to sleep against their will. Dr. Lin's recommendation was brief and firm. The kind of clarity ethics committees are built to offer when medicine and family collide. The surgeon muttered about wasted time and a donor who would never be a name on our unit again. And Eli's father folded into a chair as if his spine had finally given up. Eli looked at his parents with wet lashes and said, "You were trying to save me." But you were going to steal me. And then he asked me, quietly, if we could go back to his room somewhere the air didn't feel like a courtroom. Back in Eli's room, the world returned to its ordinary cruelty, the same fluorescent light, the same beeps, the same plastic pitcher of water that always tasted faintly of chlorine. The only thing that had changed was the air between us, heavier now, as if the fight in pre-op had left soot on every surface. Eli lay on his side with his knees drawn up, staring at the wall like it could offer a version of his life that didn't require witnesses. I pulled the curtain half closed, not to hide him, but to give him the small comfort of edges. His parents stood at the foot of the bed, unsure where to put their hands, their love suddenly homeless. His mother tried to speak first, but her words arrived tangled. Apologies snagging on justification, fear dressed up as certainty. Eli didn't let her finish. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, he just asked, when did my body stop being mine to decide? The question landed softly and still managed to split the room open because there is no gentle way to answer it. His father looked down at the hospital socks on his own feet, like he'd only now noticed how ridiculous it was to be barefoot in a place built for control. Dr. Nandakumar came in with Dr. Lin from ethics and asked everyone to breathe for a moment before anyone tried to win again. Dr. Lin said, in the same calm voice he'd used in the conference room, that consent isn't a form you get. It's a voluntary, ongoing conversation that can't survive secrecy. Eli listened with the intensity of someone who has had to become his own advocate too young, then nodded once, as if a nod could stitch up betrayal. Huang Doctor. Nandakumar offered to bring in palliative care, not to surrender. But as comfort with skill, Eli's shoulders dropped for the first time in days. Like he'd been holding himself upright out of obligation. The palliative nurse practitioner arrived with a notebook and a presence that didn't flinch from sadness. She asked Eli what mattered most if time was shorter than anyone wanted, and he said things that weren't medical at all. Real food, fresh air. His sister's laugh, without a mask between them, the ability to sleep without being startled by alarms. She asked about pain, nausea, anxiety, and built a plan in plain language. One step at a time, like laying boards across water. Jessa adjusted Eli's blankets and kept her eyes down. But I saw relief in the set of her shoulders, the kind you feel when you stop doing violence by routine. His mother tried again later, alone with Eli, and this time she didn't lead with the transplant. She told him she'd been picturing him at 5 years old, feverish and limp, and how signing papers had once felt like saving him, like proving she could keep the world from taking what she loved. Eli looked at her for a long time, then said he believed she loved him, and that was the tragedy. Love had been the reason, and love had still done harm. He let her hold his hand, but his fingers stayed stiff at first, like trust was a muscle that had cramped. When his father finally spoke, it was only to say he was sorry, and the simplicity of it made the room go quiet in a new way. That night, after the hallway had thinned and the unit settled into its late shift hush, I stood at the window of the workroom and watched snow start to fall in the parking lot light. Slow and indifferent, Dr. Nandakumar signed the last orders, then paused with her pen hovering, as if she was afraid the ink could change the story again. "You did the right thing," she said, but her voice didn't sound victorious. It sounded tired, the way you sound when you've prevented one kind of damage and still couldn't prevent the rest. In Eli's room, the monitor kept beeping steadily, and for the first time all day the sound felt less like a countdown and more like proof that he was still here, still himself. 2 days later, Eli asked me to wheel him to the hospital's small rooftop garden, the one hidden above the cafeteria vents where the air never quite loses the smell of fried onions. He wore a borrowed coat over his gown, and Jessa tucked a blanket around his legs with the tenderness of someone handling something breakable and precious. The sun was weak, but it existed, and for a few minutes that felt like a gift the hospital hadn't charged us for. Eli tilted his face toward the light and said, almost amused, that he'd forgotten what it was like to be warm without a heated blanket plugged into a wall. He talked about his sister, about how she'd been angry at him for months because anger was easier than fear, and how he wanted to go home and let her be angry in the same room again. He asked me what people wrote in charts when a patient chose to stop fighting, and I told him the truth. We write words that sound tidy because we're afraid of what the messy ones would do to us. He smiled, then his smile faded, and he said he didn't feel brave. He felt honest, and honesty was the only thing he had left that the disease couldn't take by force. Underneath his calm, I could still hear the ache, but it wasn't chaos anymore. Hatsapi. His parents came up later, moving slowly as if speed might break something again. His mother carried a paper bag from the gift shop with a ridiculous knit hat too bright. To cheerful Anne, she held it out like an offering. Eli didn't put it on, but he let it sit on his lap. And that small acceptance made his mother's eyes fill the way they had in pre-op. Except now, the tears weren't trying to control the outcome. His father apologized again, this time without the but, and Eli answered with a sentence that sounded like both mercy and boundary. I can love you and still not let you decide for me. They sat together in the winter sun, 3 people learning a new language made mostly of silence. When I went back downstairs, the transplant surgeon's note was already in the chart. Clipped and professional, the kind of writing that pretends decisions have no blood on them. The ethics consult note was there too, calmer, full of careful phrases meant to protect everyone from future blame. None of those notes captured the stairwell, the barefoot kid on cold tile. The way betrayal can make a person feel smaller than their illness ever did. I realized then that the hospital keeps records of bodies, but it's terrible at recording souls, and maybe that's why stories like this follow us home. After my shift ended, I sat in my car without turning the key, hands resting on the steering wheel like it was something to hold on to. The weight of my stethoscope in my bag felt heavier than it should, as if it had absorbed the day's arguments and carried them forward. I thought about how easily we confuse hope with entitlement. How quickly I love you can become I know better, especially when death is in the room and everyone is terrified of being the one who lets go. I also thought about Jessa stepping between a mother and a piece of paper. Not because she was against love, but because she was for the patient. Eli went home on hospice a week later, and I didn't see him again. But I still hear his voice whenever I'm tempted to treat consent like a checkbox instead of a relationship. What he taught me wasn't that stopping is noble or that fighting is foolish. It was that autonomy is not a reward for being calm or agreeable or optimistic, but a dignity you don't lose just because other people are afraid. And when I catch myself wanting to rescue someone at any cost, I remember the cold tile, the whispered chart talk, and the way a 19-year-old had to sign his own refusal just to remain the author of his last chapter.